Venom: The Last Dance had all the potential to be the explosive, action-packed, and hilarious conclusion to an otherwise compelling trilogy. Instead, what we got was a jumbled, incoherent mess that squandered the opportunities set up by its predecessors, leaving fans wondering how a story that once had so much heart and chaos could end so disappointingly. In 2018, the world was introduced to Venom, a film that defied expectations by blending dark humor, horror, and action in a way that hadn't been seen before in superhero films. Tom Hardy's portrayal of Eddie Brock, a disgraced journalist who becomes bonded with an alien symbiote, brought new life to a character that had long been relegated to comic book lore. The movie wasn't perfect, but it was fun and set the stage for a franchise with huge potential. Then came Venom: Let There Be Carnage, a sequel that expanded the bond between Eddie and Venom while introducing the menacing Carnage Cletus adversary as an equally chaotic adversary. The sequel cranked up the humor and the action, balancing the over-the-top spectacle with a surprising amount of heart, particularly in the odd couple relationship between Eddie and Venom. Naturally, expectations for the final film, Venom: The Last Dance, were high. It was supposed to wrap up the trilogy and offer fans the grand conclusion they were waiting for, but instead of delivering a satisfying finale, The Last Dance feels like a misguided attempt to force a sprawling, convoluted storyline that fails to capture the magic of its predecessors. The movie begins with a visually striking sequence on the desolate world of the symbiotes. This otherworldly environment sets the tone for what seems like a high-stakes, cosmic showdown. The introduction of Null, the ancient god, who was once the ruler of the symbiotes and now imprisoned, hints at a massive mythological expansion of the franchise. His plan to break free from his prison is set in motion with the dispatching of his deadly minions, the xenophages, who are tasked with retrieving an artifact known as the Codex. The opening builds a sense of impending doom, but it quickly becomes apparent that the film does not know how to handle this new depth it introduces. The introduction of Null is a missed opportunity. Instead of exploring his motives or his past, the film brushes past his character entirely. He's more of a plot device than a fully realized antagonist, and his role in the story ends up being inconsequential. His connection to the Codex, that artifact that is supposed to unlock his freedom, is introduced without much fanfare or explanation. The mythology behind the symbiotes, which had previously been explored in a more grounded way, is now being expanded in ways that feel unnecessary and forced. At the same time, Eddie Brock and Venom find themselves unexpectedly yanked back into their own universe. They are drawn into this new conflict, but they're largely unaware of the threat looming over them. The plot moves quickly from one scene to the next, introducing new characters and concepts without taking the time to properly develop them. This erratic pacing sets the tone for the rest of the movie and sets up a series of half-baked narrative threads that never really pay off. In addition to the return of Eddie and Venom, The Last Dance introduces a slew of new characters. First, there's General Strickland, a mysterious figure whose motivations are unclear from the outset. While his character could have been an intriguing addition to the film, he is relegated to the background for much of the movie. His role is never fully explained, and by the time the story is over, we're left wondering why he was even introduced in the first place. Then there's Dr. Teddy Payne, a brilliant scientist who plays a key role in the film's unfolding events. However, despite being portrayed as a character with a lot of scientific knowledge, Dr. Payne never really contributes anything of significance to the plot. His expertise in symbiotes and the Codex is mentioned, but he serves more as a vehicle for exposition rather than a fully realized character. His interactions with Eddie and the other characters are minimal, and his ultimate fate feels inconsequential. The most notable new character, though, is Toxin, a symbiote who has the potential to be a formidable adversary. Toxin's introduction builds up expectations that he will be a major player in the story, but much like the other new characters, he is never properly developed. His motivations are unclear, and his role in the film's events feels forced. Instead of feeling like a legitimate threat, Toxin ends up being little more than a plot device designed to move the story along. This lack of character development is one of the film's most significant issues. The new characters are introduced without sufficient build-up or explanation, leaving them feeling shallow and unimportant. They fail to add any real depth to the story and ultimately detract from the central focus of the film, the relationship between Eddie and Venom. In the previous films, one of the strongest aspects of the story was the relationship between Eddie Brock and Venom. Their odd couple dynamic, Eddie, the disgraced journalist, and Venom, the alien symbiote, was at the heart of the franchise, providing both comedy and emotional weight. The chemistry between Tom Hardy and his CGI counterpart was palpable, and their interactions often served as the film's most compelling moments. However, in The Last Dance, this dynamic is completely lost. Instead of building on their relationship and continuing to explore the humor and tension that made their bond so unique, the film instead forces out a series of half-hearted jokes that undermine their development. The moments that should have been emotional or tense are bogged down by slapstick humor that doesn't feel earned or in line with the tone of the previous films. Venom, once a menacing yet lovable anti-hero, feels more like a caricature than a complex character. His motivations are unclear, and his constant bickering with Eddie is more annoying than endearing. Eddie, on the other hand, seems out of sync with his symbiote partner. The film fails to build on the emotional journey Eddie has gone through in the previous films, and by the time the final act rolls around, we're left with a sense that their relationship has regressed rather than evolved. The film's attempts at humor, though frequent, feel forced and out of place. In one moment, Eddie and Venom engage in a ridiculous argument over something trivial, and instead of providing the comedic relief the scene intends, it feels like an awkward disruption to the flow of the story. This tonal dissonance, where moments of humor clash with the supposed gravity of the plot, becomes a pervasive issue throughout the film. It prevents the audience from emotionally connecting with the characters, leaving the final confrontation between Eddie and Venom to feel anticlimactic. One of the strengths of the previous Venom films was their intense action sequences, whether it was the chaotic battles between Eddie and other symbiotes, or the dramatic moments of Venom unleashing his full power. The action always felt exciting and fresh. Unfortunately, The Last Dance falls short in this department. The xenophages, which are introduced as terrifying threats, are almost immediately reduced to background fodder. Their design is menacing, but they are barely utilized in the film's action scenes. The battle sequences are uninspired, often relying too heavily on CGI, without offering anything truly innovative. The final climactic battle, which should have been a high point of the trilogy, ends up feeling underwhelming and rushed. The special effects, while flashy, do little to build tension or excitement, and the lack of suspense makes the conclusion feel hollow. Where the first two films balanced spectacle with character moments, The Last Dance only offers spectacle without the emotional stakes that made the action matter. The fight scenes are chaotic, but without a clear sense of direction or purpose, they become forgettable and fail to leave an impact. The symbiote mythology, which had been teased throughout the first two films, takes center stage in The Last Dance. However, instead of expanding on what made the symbiotes interesting, the film forces a complex, unnecessary backstory that complicates things without adding value. The introduction of the Codex and the lore surrounding Null and the symbiotes feels more like an afterthought than a well-integrated part of the story. While the attempt to expand the mythology might have been well-intentioned, it ultimately distracts from the core narrative. The Codex, which is central to Null's plan, is never fully explained, and its significance is lost in the chaotic pacing. What could have been a compelling exploration of the symbiote origins and the true nature of these creatures becomes a muddled subplot that detracts from the film's focus. The symbiotes, once terrifying and fascinating, are reduced to mere plot devices, and by the end they feel more like background noise than integral characters in the story. Venom: The Last Dance is a frustratingly mediocre film that fails to live up to the high expectations set by its predecessors. The relationship between Eddie and Venom, which was the heart of the franchise, is hollowed out, replaced by poorly executed humor and unearned conflicts. The introduction of new characters and expanded mythology feels forced and underdeveloped, detracting from the core story rather than enriching it. The action, while visually impressive, lacks the creativity and intensity that made the previous film so thrilling. Ultimately, The Last Dance is a jumbled, disappointing end to what could have been a standout trilogy in the superhero genre.